Hello, everyone. I'm Sharon Holbrook with Your Teen, and I'm here with Uju Asika. Am I saying your name right?
Uju Asika, yes.
Asika. I'm sorry. It's important to get names right, that's for sure. I'm here because Uju has a wonderful new book out called Bringing Up Race, How to Raise a Kind Child in a Prejudiced World. Uju is based in London, and the book came out there, I believe, in the last fall, right?
It did, yes, in September.
And we are here. It just came out in the US this week, so we're very excited. Can you show us the cover, Uju, so we can find it in the bookstore here? So this is the US cover, and so when you're looking in the bookstore to grab it, and this is what it looks like, or on Amazon or wherever you want to buy it. So I'd love to start by talking about how you came to write the book, Uju.
Yeah, so I'm a blogger and a writer and a mum. So that was kind of like my foundation for writing the book. And there was a relative of mine who had suggested I write on this topic. She was like, you need to tell people, you need to give people advice, because, as a parent and a Black mother raising my kids in London, obviously I've had a lot of experience in this area. And at first I was very resistant to even writing about race and just sort of putting myself out there, as I thought I'm not an academic in that sense. I'm not a race expert. But then when I sort of thought about the impact that I could have, just sharing my own stories and also other people's stories, so yeah, I just became really motivated to write it. And there are so many stories from other parents of different ethnicities in the book, which was really important to me because I wanted to get lots of people into the conversation.
Right. And race can be such a difficult thing to talk about. And I love how you approached it in such a warm and open way, and how approachable and wonderful your stories are. When let's start by talking about why we need to talk about race, because there are still folks out there who think that it just makes everything worse to talk about race. Can't we just treat everybody the same? Can't we be colorblind? Can you talk a little bit about why that's not the approach we should take?
Yeah, I mean, the title Bringing Up Race, is a sort of play on words. Obviously, there's the element of bringing up children, but there's also this thing where people go, oh, why do you keep bringing up race? Especially, it's said to people of color, like, why are you always bringing this up? Because it matters, it affects us and affects all of us. And I think there's a thing with, especially parents of my generation. I'm sort of Gen X parent, and there were many, especially white parents, who were raised with this idea that if you didn't talk about race, then everyone would just kind of muddle along happily, and we'd all be one big happy family and everything would be great. And actually, this isn't the case. All that happens when you don't talk about race, especially if you don't talk about race with your children, is you leave this gap, because society is racist. I mean, it just is. We live under the shadow of white supremacy across the world, not just in America. And if it's not spoken about overtly, it just carries on under the surface. And those of us who are people of color, raising kids of color, are suffering. But then also white families don't know how to interact or engage, and it becomes this sort of elephant in the room. And the more you talk about it and the more we understand each other, then we can actually change things for the better.
Right. And families with people of color in them, or families of color, know this already, that we can't avoid talking about race. And just the question of should we talk about race is one that is from a white perspective, because we live in a default white society, on both sides of the Atlantic, in both the UK and the US. So what are some things, let's go there. What are some things that you wish that white families would be talking about with kids? And we know our audience. I'm Gen X also, and probably a lot of the folks watching are as well, because we're parents of teens and middle schoolers. I think you are as well,
Yes.
and I am too. So what should we be talking about? And if we haven't started and we feel like, I just don't know where to begin, I feel behind, how can we initiate that with our kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question because race is a big topic. When I
Right.
started writing, bringing up race, I was like, a deer in the headlights. Where do I even begin? There is so much to cover. Race literally affects us from before birth until after we're buried, So I think for white families, I would say just start the conversation. I always say it's never too early and it's never too late. So even if you don't have kids yet, start talking with your partner, your peers, ask each other what kinds of, one thing to do is just to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking to a child, ask questions about what they think about. If your child is really young, you can ask questions about skin color. What do you understand about skin color? Or ask questions about who they mingle with at school, what they understand about different races, because you're always trying to learn. Go into conversations with this idea that you're going to learn from each conversation. And then if your child is a teen, you can obviously start asking questions about stuff that they might have heard in the news. Obviously, race has been a huge topic, specifically since last summer and the murder of George Floyd, which
Yes.
pretty much every child, at least in sort of our age range, has certainly heard about George Floyd.
Right.
So all of these incidences offer an opportunity to start a conversation, but don't wait until you've heard some tragic news story or some major event. Just start, try to normalize it, make it part of everyday conversation. I think one really useful thing is just to use books. There are so many books out there now which can offer conversation prompts, or, no matter what age range, your child is, there's always something you can talk about, like who is in the story, who is at the center of the story, who's missing from the story, why do you think that is, and just keep having these conversations. And just, it doesn't matter if I still have really messy, rambling conversations with my own kids about race. There's this misperception that if you're Black, you've got it sorted and you understand how to talk about race. Actually, no, it's really awkward and often painful for a Black family or Black parent to talk to their child about race, but we have to do it. And now it's for white families to feel like we have to talk about it as well. So even if it's difficult, messy, awkward, just keep talking about it and it'll get better, it'll get easier.
I love what you said I love many things that you said in your book, but I love what you said about stories and the power of stories, and also about books, which you just mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about representation. For children of all races, it's important to see and hear all different stories from different perspectives. How can we share those stories with our kids when there has been this imbalance, this white European-centric or white American-centric perspective in a lot of our media and literature and even toys and everything?
I would say we're very lucky where we are now because there has been progress. So now compared to, for instance, when I grew up and there was barely anyone, I grew up in England and I was in an all-white school. And if there was any Black woman on TV, it was like, oh, Uju's on TV. It was that was the representation. And now there's a lot more choice. There are a lot more options. And, just go out of your way. Be intentional about the kind of stories that you read. Be intentional. Look at your bookshelves. How many of these stories are written by African Americans or Indigenous Americans, Latino Americans? What kinds of stories are you sharing with your children? And like I keep saying, who is at the center of these stories? It can't always just be the same white,
Right.
Back in the day we would say the white male voice, and then you had more female voices entering. And now you've got to have, just open it up. The world is big. tell many stories, listen to many stories.
I love that. I just want to pop in, and Chevy's asking, "What book is this?" Let's remind our viewers. It's right here behind Uju. Bringing Up Race: How to Raise a
Sure.
Kind Child in a Prejudiced World by Uju Asika. So we hope that you'll all find it. Let's talk a little bit about those. I think many of us, all of us, have had those situations where something is said or done that is racist, just to put it plainly. And it may be another kid at school. It may be that our kid says something that we are reacting to. But let's start with not our kid. What do we do when our child encounters racist behavior? How do we prepare them? Do we prepare them for that? How do we equip them to respond, whether they're white, Black, Latinx, or whatever background our child, or multi backgrounds our child might come from?
Yeah, I think absolutely we need to prepare our kids. Most children will experience racism from the time they enter a school setting. That's when you'll first, typically, no matter what shade of skin you are, your first encounter with racism and racist ideas comes up is often at school, from the age of around 3 upwards. So, you need to prepare your kids. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations at home. Then your kids feel like they have more of an awareness of what actually is racist. Because a lot of racism, when people talk about racism, they think about, some horrible words scrawled on the wall, or like some physical assault. But actually a lot of racism comes in the form of microaggressions, like little small things that chip away at people. And it's important to recognize it and call it out. Literally, just, you can stand up and say, that's racist. Don't say that. It's good for kids to know that racism is a hate crime. So there's no point. It's not just about, I'm being rude. Someone has said something rude, or someone has said something mean. No, you've said something that constitutes a crime and can actually, you can keep escalating until you report it to the authorities if it gets that bad. So the important thing is for kids to just interrupt whatever racist idea or comment comes out. Just stop it in its tracks. Say, that's not okay. That is racist. Talk about your feelings as well, often. I think it's helpful. Like, I really don't like the way you're speaking about, this group of people, or what you've said is really hurtful to me. Try and provoke an empathy response. Obviously, depending on the situation, if it's getting a little bit out of hand, your best bet is probably to just get out of the situation and then go and report it to somebody. Don't just leave it. The most important thing is not to do nothing or act like nothing is happening, especially if you're a bystander. It's really important for bystanders to come up and be allies and say, even if you just go and stand with someone who's experiencing racism and ask them, are you okay? How are you doing? Show them your support, because it can be very isolating to experience racism.
Right. And sometimes not only do folks have to feel the brunt of the racism, but then be questioned about whether it's really so bad. So it's almost, it can be a double hit, first the insult, then, why are you being so sensitive, or they didn't mean it. And then how can we be less sensitive? Let's talk now about when our old child might be the one who did something inappropriate, or was accused of doing something inappropriate, especially for white families. Being accused of being racist can feel like the worst thing, even though being accused of being racist isn't the same as experiencing racism. But we can be very defensive. So how do you have any advice for how parents can approach that? I mean, how should we feel or react if we think our child has done something inappropriate, or we're told, your child was saying these things at school, and our first response is, not my child. How can we approach that and move forward in a positive way?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's one of these things. It's an ego response. And I think with families, and especially with your kids, you're trying to teach them not to always have that ego response. And you've got to have that as a parent as well. You can't just be like, oh no, this is a reflection of my terrible parenting. Your goal now is to actually understand what has happened and then figure out how you can make it better. That's all you can do as a parent. So if someone says, oh, your child said something racist at school, your first response shouldn't be, oh no, not my child. And also you shouldn't respond with kind of, oh no, you're racist, which is another thing that tends to happen. It becomes very sort of accusatory, and you're blaming people, and it feels like, oh, I've got this label of being a racist. I don't really think of children as being a racist. They've learned, they pick up racist ideas from society. All of our children pick up very, very offensive ideas from society, because society is full of like racist, sexist, toxic ideas. So the important thing is to sit and try and understand, where did this come from? What actually happened? Why did they say this? Why did they behave in this way? And then figure out what you can do to make it better. It's like a learning opportunity. So sit down as a family and say, okay, this is a learning opportunity for all of us, and then figure out what we can do to correct it, especially if you can make amends with, whoever they were being racist to. That's the most important thing. Like, how can you make amends with that person?
Right. I think that's something that came through in your book too, that it's important to set aside the shame as much as we can, and move into the learning, and how can we go forward. And I think that's so helpful. I wanted to ask you about your perspective being based in the UK. I know you spent some years in the US as well. And I'm wondering how you, it seems that you've written the book primarily for a UK audience, which I found fascinating, because I love seeing the perspective on the US and our situation and issues with race from the outside, having a more global perspective. What do you expect to US audiences to get out of this? Or what comment can you make on how you feel things are different in the US versus the UK when it comes to race?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think with the book, even though it's based, obviously it's set in the UK because that's where I've grown up mostly. But you will hear experiences from people, outside. Like a friend talks about her experience in Turkey, people's experiences in Amsterdam. Like I said, I spoke to parents of different ethnicities, because this is the whole point. Like, the whole issue of racism is a global problem, and it needs a local solution and a sort of universal approach. In terms of racism in the UK, it's very strange. I think racism in the UK has a very British character, which is very sort of under the radar. And it's like, on the surface, everything is fine. And then under the radar, you're dealing with a whole lot of stuff. So especially since last summer, when people were campaigning and Black Lives Matter became like this huge global thing, a lot of people in Britain were quite shocked. They were like, oh, why are the Black people here complaining? Britain is fine. We're not America. We're not running around and burning down streets and all this stuff. And actually, it was an opportunity for people of color here to talk about the racism that we've experienced, which, like I said, is a lot more under the surface, but is no less damaging. So, I'm hoping that readers in America can relate to the stories in the book, stories, personal experiences, my own stories, personal experiences from other parents, as well as learn from the perspective that you get from listening to people experiencing racism in different settings.
That's so helpful and interesting. I think we will head towards wrapping up, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to bring up anything else you think that our audience, our US parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers, should be thinking about or hearing now. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that we really should have, or you'd like to?
Um, it's hard to know, but I just think, just keep talking, have these conversations. And, I always like to say when you're having these conversations, especially with your child, leave the door open. So don't slam the door in their face. What happens sometimes, because we're so panicky about race, you tend to just shut down. If your child asks you a question and it's coming from a place of curiosity, but if the question is a little bit potentially worrying or offensive, you might just shut it down. Either say, "Oh, let's not talk about that," or that's wrong, and then you shut it down. Actually, just leave the door open. Like, find out, okay, where did you get that idea? Or why do you think that is? Keep answering, keep discussing, because the whole point is like having these conversations creates a safe space for you to be able to keep learning, keep growing as a family, not just as parents and kids.
That's very helpful. I think you said in the book it's kind of like the sex talk. It's not.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be just that one talk. And I would think it gets easier too. The more that it's a regular conversation, the more we get used to talking about these tricky things and that are so important. Thank you so much for joining us. I was delighted to talk to you, and I know our viewers were happy to enjoy hearing your perspective too. And I hope they will check out your book. And Uju, is there anywhere else they should find you on the web or on social media? What's the best way to keep in touch?
Yeah, I'm at Babes About Town on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. My blog is babesabouttown.com. And yeah, Bringing Up Race is on Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold.
All right, check it out, everyone. And thank you so much, Uju. Have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
All right, bye.